Hello, folks. Thank you for tuning in to another installment of the Federalist Files. We're going to be going over Federalist number 73 today. It is titled The Provision for the Support of the Executive and the Veto Power. It is written by Alexander Hamilton, March 21st, 1788. Topics include emoluments cannot be modified during term, veto responsibilities for self-defense against the legislature. Veto will cut down on bad lawmaking and protect the rights of citizens. So this entire paper has to do with what he calls having an energetic executive branch, as Alexander Hamilton characterizes it. So he starts off this paper. He talks about a little bit about veto power, and then it also deters the legislative branch in making bad laws. But it's not an absolute negative. It is a qualified negative. I'll get to all of it. I'll explain all of it as we go on here. So the third ingredient to an energetic executive branch is an adequate provision for its support. Hamilton fears that without the proper provisions, and this is me quoting him here, and I quote, "It is evident that without proper attention to this article, the separation of the executive from the legislative department would be merely nominal and nugatory. The legislature, with a discretionary power over the salary and emoluments of the chief magistrate, could render him as obsequious to their will as they might think proper to him. They might in most cases either reduce him by famine or tempt him by largesses to surrender at discretion his judgment to their inclinations." End quote. So he's saying specifically in a broader sense, the point of having a qualified negative, as in the veto power in the presidency, is to render the president much more independent of the legislative body and the legislative branch. Otherwise, then he would be dependent on them. Thus, the reasoning for, and he's talking about emoluments a little bit, he gets into that as well. The legislative branch has a discretionary power to give out emoluments to the president, but it usually starts at the beginning of the term, and it cannot be changed during the term or in the middle as to attempt to acquiesce the power of the presidency. And he's going to kind of go over that a little bit here. So without proper attention, the legislature, with its discretionary powers, can reduce the emoluments of the president and surrender his judgment to their inclinations. Hamilton feared that the legislature would do something like this. So Hamilton, he introduces the provision, and this is the provision specifically talking about the emoluments. So he states, and I quote, I think it's actually called the emoluments clause in the Constitution. So he states, and I quote, "The President of the United States shall, at stated times, receive for his services a compensation which shall neither be increased nor diminished during the period for which he shall have been elected, and he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them." End quote. So he's saying you're going to have it, it's going to be set, it's going to be set before he starts his terms of service, and then as he goes throughout his term, it cannot be modified in any way, because if it was modified by the legislative body, then they can use that they can wield that as some sort of blackmail power against the presidency and attempt to sway him one way or the other. So it goes on. This provision restricts the legislature from procuring an inability to increase or diminish the president's wage during the period for which he shall have been elected. The president, additionally, during that period cannot receive any other payment from the United States other than their wage as president. This is the reason why he had Trump kind of take all of his businesses and just hand them over to his sons. He no longer was involved with running those, because when you're the president, you're supposed to specifically just do that job as the president. You also can't hold any other position in government and collect any emoluments, any source of payment for holding any other positions in office. It's pretty clear cut, it's pretty simple. So Hamilton next, he notes, and I quote, "The legislature, on the appointment of a president, is once for all to declare what shall be the compensation for his services during the time for which he shall have been elected. This done, they will have no power to alter it, either by increase or diminution, till a new period of service by a new election commences. They can neither weaken his fortitude by operating on his necessities, nor corrupt his integrity by appealing to his avarice." End quote. So, simply put, they can't give him more pay to try to sway him one way or the other. They can't take away his pay to attempt to do the same thing. While, he's serving out his term at the very beginning, that's usually laid out. The president, I think it's $400,000 a year is what they get paid. Trump pretty much gave all that money to charity during his 4 years. So also, he will be, in this paper, generally, it's the requisites of energy he goes over. So this paper is dedicated to explaining the veto responsibilities of the president and the powers therein. First, the power of the qualified negative to object to any bill from the legislature, which in result can be overturned by 2/3 of each house of the legislative body in the federal government. So meaning, usually to get law passed through, let's say no filibuster involved, you need a majority in the House, and then you need a majority as well in the Senate. Gets to the president's desk, the president can sign off on it and approve it, or the president can hit it with a veto. If he hits it with a veto, then it goes back for more further deliberations in the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. Then they have to vote and approve it by 2/3 of the vote. So that's how they override the veto power. So it's considered a qualified negative rather than an absolute. An absolute negative would be the president vetoing it, and then there's no deliberations, and what the president says is what goes in that case. And that's kind of what the power was in Great Britain at the time, and he kind of goes on to explain that in this paper as well. So he states next, and I quote, "The first thing that offers itself to our observation is the qualified negative of the president upon the acts or resolutions of the two houses of the legislature, or in other words, his power of returning all bills with objections to have the effect of preventing their becoming laws, unless they should afterwards be ratified by 2/3 of each of the component members of the legislative body." So quite simply, he's just stating exactly what I just said. It has to go back to the two components of the legislative body if he decides to veto, and then they can attempt to override the veto with 2/3 of vote in both chambers of the legislature. So next he states, and I quote, "The propensity of the legislative departments to intrude upon the rights and to absorb the powers of the other departments has been already suggested and repeated. The insufficiency of a mere parchment delineation of the boundaries of each has also been remarked upon, and the necessity of furnishing each with constitutional arms for its own defense has been inferred and proved. From these clear and indubitable principles results the propriety of a negative, either absolute or qualified, in the executive upon the acts of the legislative branches." End quote. So he says, simply in republics throughout history, you've always seen most of the power in the legislative branch to begin with, and because of that, the legislative branch has used their power to start to take over the other branches, intrude upon the rights of the other branches, and consume the other branches to the point where all of the duties, all of the roles of government, all become just the legislative body and just the Congress. And then you would have the judicial branch as well as the executive power would kind of just be, a dead body that would just be there. It would be active in the point of you have somebody in the position, but realistically it was they could do nothing. They were powerless. They were rendered a powerless body because the legislative authority would take all their power from them, and they would move it all to the legislative branch, bypassing law after law, and that is the reason for the veto power. It's supposed to protect the president, and then it's also as well supposed to protect the constituency, the people themselves as well. And he'll explain that as well in this paper. So Hamilton, he asserts, and I quote, "He might gradually be stripped of his authorities by successive resolutions or annihilated by a single vote, and in one mode or the other, the legislative and executive powers might speedily come to be blended in the same hands." Hamilton states the executive ought to possess a constitutional and effectual power of self-defense. End quote. So yeah, they can use their power in the legislative branch to render the executive pretty much useless and powerless, and then absorb all of his power. And we historically have seen that in republics. We kind of actually saw, to an extent, in the Articles of Confederation, just all the power to start off was laid out in a Congress assembled. There really was no executive authority. There was no type of really judicial authority in a federal government. There was in individual state jurisdictions. So next he goes on. and he states, and I quote, "The propriety of a negative has upon some occasions been combated by an observation that it was not to be presumed a single man would possess more virtue and wisdom than a number of men, and that unless this presumption should be entertained, it would be improper to give the executive magistrate any species of control over the legislative body," end quote. So he's saying historically, the way it's worked is, how are you going to say that one man somehow is more virtuous than a group of men in the Congress? And that's kind of what the objecting opinion is in this case. Now he goes on to kind of debunk that objecting opinion. He states, and I quote, "But this observation, when examined, will appear rather specious than solid. The propriety of the thing does not turn upon the supposition of superior wisdom or virtue in the executive, but upon the supposition that the legislature will not be infallible, that the love of power may sometimes betray it into a disposition to encroach upon the rights of other members of the government, that a spirit of faction may sometimes pervert its deliberations, that impressions of the moment may sometimes hurry it into measures of which itself, on maturer reflection, would condemn," end quote. So he's saying what the objection here is, and the reason for the veto power, is not to say that the executive is somehow going to be more virtuous than the legislative branch. He said the reason for the veto power is the statement of the legislative branch isn't perfect. They're not, as he characterizes, infallible. They're not the perfect beings that never make mistakes, which is why we don't have, if the executive was to be this virtuous person that's more virtuous than the legislative body, then you would give the executive a full-on absolute veto power. In this case, it's a qualified veto power, a qualified negative instead, to say the legislative authority is not perfect. They may make mistakes, which is another safeguard, and that's the reason for having the president, who has this veto power that can be still overridden by the legislative authority. But pretty much this protects us all from a mob rule-like system, which is really weird, because I've talked to libertarians on Twitter, and I've kind of talked to them about this whole Senate thing, how the Senate used to be elected by the state legislative branches and what they thought about it, and they said they liked the idea of a democracy-like rule. And then I go, that's kind of weird, because now you guys are libertarians, but you guys like the idea of mob rule. So I don't really know. When I had this idea of what libertarians were, and then I started to follow some of the big, I guess the more prominent names in the Libertarian Party all over Twitter, and then I see their statements, and I read, and I go, I think this is why, and people like to blame the two-party system. They say the two-party system is the reason for why libertarianism doesn't work. The Libertarian Party, the problem why they don't work is because they're all over the place. No one actually knows what their standards are. They almost have not actually looked into the issues enough. They just hate the two other governing parties, and that's what characterizes them as a party, and that's kind of what brings them all together. And that's what the problem is none of them actually read into any of this stuff. They kind of just make a determining opinion that is counter-narrative to whatever the two parties like. I guess that's really the way. They just go, oh, you're a conservative? Okay, you like this? I'm just going to like the opposite side because it's kind of like the edgy thing to do, and I don't actually have a reason for doing so. Which I kind of think is in. I just don't really understand. There's no set standard. And then when you explain to them, because the way I thought of libertarianism was freedom, the most freedom possible, as well as, going back to our founding principles in a lot of ways. But it's not. I don't really know what it is at this point, because they're all over the radar. And that's why the Libertarian Party isn't successful. It has nothing to actually do with the two parties shutting them down, the two-party system. It's just that their views to begin with are somewhat unpopular in some ways, and then they're also all over the map. They're flip-flopping on everything. There's really no set standard being in the Libertarian Party, in my view. So he goes on to state next, and I quote, "But this observation, when examined, will appear rather specious." Oh no, I've already read that. So Hamilton, he characterizes the power of veto further. He states, and I quote, "The primary inducement to conferring the power in question upon the executive is to enable him to defend himself. The secondary one is to increase the chances in favor of the community against the passing of bad laws through haste, inadvertence, or design," end quote. So not only is the power of veto important for the executive branch for self-defense, but additionally it also provides an actual safeguard of security in the passing of bad laws for the people through some sort of haste, like he says, inadvertence. You see the legislative body usually, for example, actually, the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act, Terrible piece of legislation. I think there's a lot of people that oppose it. I think on both sides actually as well, because it pretty much legalizes the spying on American citizens based on reasonable suspicion and no longer probable cause. So there's a lot of people that oppose that, and that was done right after 9/11. It was hasty, and it was reactionary. It was a purely emotional reactionary piece of legislation that did not follow any of our founding principles. So that often happens in the legislative branch, and the point of having that executive with their veto powers, they would be able to veto something like that. But they didn't, at the time. So that was a terrible piece of legislation. It doesn't even follow the Constitution, that's why it should have got struck down on multiple occasions. If it went through the legislative body, it should have got struck down by the president. Didn't get struck down by the president, and then it should have also not passed through the Supreme Court as well. So, in essence, the power of veto will operate as a self-defense mechanism to curtail usurpations from the legislative branch, which will try to expand their powers at the expense of the executive and the people. It will also provide as a defense against the legislative branch from attempting to confiscate the constitutional rights of the citizens as well. So Hamilton, he states the argument of his dissenters, and I quote, "It may perhaps be said that the power of preventing bad laws includes that of preventing good ones, and may be used to the one purpose as well as to the other," end quote. So he's saying that dissenters say, well, yeah, he's going to have the power to prevent bad laws from being passed, but then also he's going to have the power to prevent good laws from being passed as well. If I can historically sit here and think about a time that a president has used the veto power to shut down good law, I honestly, I really can't think of it. He's only used it in most cases to prevent, from what I've seen, to prevent bad law from being passed. And even if that is the case, if it's good law, then if there's a real consensus that this is considered good law, then the 2/3 in the legislative branch would be able to overpower him anyway. So he objects to this characterization. He states, and I quote, "They," and when he says they, he says well thought out Americans, people that are well read, "they will consider every institution calculated to restrain the excess of lawmaking and to keep things in the same state in which they happen to be at any given period as much more likely to do good than harm, because it is favorable to greater stability in the system of legislation. The injury which may possibly be done by defeating a few good laws will be amply compensated by the advantage of preventing a number of bad ones," end quote. So I think this is pretty significant here, this quote. I agree with it wholeheartedly. I think that the power to be able to veto bad law will far outweigh some of the disadvantages of vetoing of good laws, and historically, this does stand up as correct. You want less and less laws come from the federal head. You'd much more rather have the regulations come from the state bodies themselves, because those are the people that are closest in the state government to the people themselves that live in their independent states. That's the reason it's the sovereignty of state powers, rather than have everything run from the very top from the federal government, have it run by state, and then depending on what the laws are in individual states, people will move to whichever state is the better state to go to. That's what federalism is. It's recognizing the sovereignty of the individual state. So simply, the proposed system is set to prevent fallacious and unnecessary lawmaking, because the disadvantages from bad law far outweighs the advantages of good laws. So therefore, Hamilton would rather have a system of few good laws with an absence of bad laws than a system that consists of some good laws and some bad laws, which makes sense. So Hamilton argues, if you want to use the example of the New Deal, there's been so many bad laws that have gone through. And I can't sit here, I really can't sit here and think, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe somebody can point something out to me. You can always email me, I'll leave that in the description below, of any law that's been passed or any law that's been vetoed that's been considered a good law. And we can hash that out, because I don't really know of one. So Hamilton argues that the fears of his colleagues are baseless in terms of confronting the concept of an overuse of veto power by the executive. He cites the British monarch hasn't used his absolute negative in a considerable period of time in fear of the legislature and displeasuring the nation. So he uses the King of Great Britain as an example. He states, and I quote, "A king of Great Britain, with all his train of sovereign attributes and with all the influence he draws from 1,000 sources, would at this day hesitate to put a negative upon the joint resolutions of the two houses of Parliament. he would not fail to exert the utmost resources of that influence to strangle a measure disagreeable to him in its progress to the throne, to avoid being reduced to the dilemma of permitting it to take effect, or of risking the displeasure of the nation by an opposition to the sense of the legislative body." End quote. So they're saying even the King of Great Britain, with his absolute negative, has yet to really use it in a very long period of time. And the reason for that is if he disagrees from this position, if he disagrees with the legislative body, it's an absolute, so it's not like it goes back and gets kicked back to the legislative branch. It's just dead on arrival when it shows up and he signs off on it. That means that the people themselves will know who is directly responsible for the turndown of whatever law it was, rather than further deliberations in the legislative branch. Then you can kind of lay the blame on multiple branches of government, where in this case, in Great Britain, you would just lay the blame at the king, which is actually the problem with having an absolute negative to begin with. And that's why the king would not really want to use the absolute negative, because then in the eyes of the people, it would make him look worse if he were to turn down some sort of good law. So Hamilton, he references the power of the veto in the executive. He states, and I quote, "It is evident that there would be greater danger of his not using his power when necessary than of his using it too often or too much," which he's right, because it is a qualified negative. It's not absolute. He can always be overpowered by the legislative authority, rather than just let authoritarian laws pass through the government. So Hamilton, he alludes to the scrupulous mindset that the president will have when employing this power because of his fear of impeachment. In the case for which this power is chiefly designed, on an immediate attack of the constitutional rights of the executive, or in the case of the public good and the rights of the citizens sacrificed, a president of intestinal fortitude would be stimulated by his responsibility to the people and interest in the power of his office. So Hamilton, he concludes by explaining the reasoning behind a qualified negative rather than an absolute negative, like I was stating before. He states, and I quote, "Instead of an absolute negative, it is proposed to give the executive the qualified negative already described. This is a power which would be much more readily exercised than the other. A man who might be afraid to defeat a law by his single veto might not scruple to return it for reconsideration, subject to being finally rejected only in the event of more than 1/3 of each house concurring in the sufficiency of his objections. He would be encouraged by the reflection that if his opposition should prevail, it would embark in it a very respectable proportion of the legislative body, whose influence would be united with his in supporting the propriety of his conduct in the public opinion." End quote. So this is it sounds a little bit in the weeds. The absolute negative is terrible. The idea of it is a terrible idea, because then the executive isn't going to use it. If the executive uses it, it's a total shutdown of the law. Everybody knows who to blame. So the executive, therefore, does not want to use it because they want to get reelected, right? So having this qualified negative is a better idea, because then if more than 1/3 of the legislative body agrees with the president, then this is a shutdown law, and then the blame goes upon the executive. It also goes upon some of the legislatures as well, some of the legislators as well. So that would make this power more often used by the executive branch, by the president, and it also gives a decentralization of the power, which is a good thing. And then it makes the president feel less, I guess, rather anxiety, or less afraid to use this power. And that's why it's important for him to be able to have that qualified negative. So Hamilton, he asserts that an absolute negative would procure a much more harsh opinion of the executive. For example, the entire legislative body can agree on a legislative act, and the executive would be able to defeat it by one single vote. So he states next, and I quote, "A direct and categorical negative has something in the appearance of it more harsh and more apt to irritate than the mere suggestion of argumentative objections to be approved or disapproved by those to whom they are addressed, in proportion as it would be less apt to offend. It would be more apt to be exercised, and for this very reason, it may in practice be found more effectual." End quote. So he puts it in a really solid, simple way, is it would be much more likely to irritate and offend the people if you had an absolute negative. So we have a qualified negative instead, and it will be much more apt to be exercised because it's going to be less irritating to the people. For that very reason, it makes it much more effectual. So the excerpt above signifies that a qualified negative would be more likely be used because the action would serve as less abrasive to the legislative body and the people, whereas the absolute negative can cause instability in the executive by casting a much more irritating form of recourse, where the executive would just shut it down whenever they wanted to. So he goes on. He states, and I quote, "A power of this nature in the executive will often have a silent and unperceived, though forcible, operation, when men engaged in unjustifiable pursuits are aware that the obstructions may come from a quarter which they cannot control. They will often be restrained by the bare apprehension of opposition from doing what they would with eagerness rush into if no such external impediments were to be feared." End quote. And he's also saying now is, if the executive didn't have this power of veto, then you would find the legislative authority doing whatever they wanted, unchecked, without even thinking it through to give themselves more power. The fact that we have this qualified negative also draws attention to whatever authoritarian or oppressive measures the legislative authority is trying to push on the people. If they're trying to pass some sort of gun confiscation law and the executive says, "I'm vetoing this," and people don't really know about it, but then it's a big deal when the president goes and vetoes it, and then let's say he has some sort of press conference or there's articles. At this time it would be some sort of newspapers would be written about the president. They'll be sent out. Then the people are much more aware of this legislation that tried to slide right under the rug on the people. So next he goes on. He states, and I quote, "This qualified negative, as has been elsewhere remarked, is in this state vested in a council." So when he says in this state, he's talking about the New York, the qualified negative. And I have actually stated this example before. So he says, "In this state is a New York vested in a council consisting of the governor with the chancellor and judges of the Supreme Court, or any two of them. It has been freely employed upon a variety of occasions and frequently with success, and its utility has become so apparent that persons who, in compiling the Constitution, were violent opposers of it, have from experience become its declared admirers." End quote. So he's saying what we're proposing in the Constitution is different than what we have currently in New York, and the problem with the one in New York is when you go to in New York, when you attempt to veto in the governor's place, then now when it gets kicked down to some weird council where the governor has a say in the council, has some judges as well in it, and it's just too much of a commingling of powers. So we didn't adopt that veto power in the Constitution. Instead, he's going to go on to explain how they adopted it in the Massachusetts Constitution, a symbol for veto power. This is the very last quote. He states, and I quote, "I have in another place remarked that the convention in the formation of this part of their plan had departed from the model of the Constitution of this state in favor of that of Massachusetts. Two strong reasons may be imagined for this preference. One is that the judges who are to be the interpreters of the law might receive an improper bias from having given a previous opinion in their revisionary capacities. The other is that by being often associated with the executive, they might be induced to embark too far in the political views of that magistrate, and thus a dangerous combination might by degrees be cemented between the executive and judiciary departments. It is impossible to keep the judges too distinct from every other avocation than that of expounding the laws. It is peculiarly dangerous to place them in a situation to be either corrupted or influenced by the executive power." End quote. Yeah, so having them even in this position their job is to interpret the laws. Their job really is not to pass legislation. So it's kind of weird to even throw them in that position in a council with the governor, and then the governor's also not supposed to make laws as well. So it's weird to even throw him in the council too. After he vetoes, and he says this would create a very weird relationship between the executive and the judicial branch, because the judicial branch is kind of they're nominated by the governor or the executive in this case. So then it would make them kind of reliant on the governor for their future positions. and the future character of the judicial branch. And if they don't agree with the governor in veto cases, then he would take that out on them. It would just create a terrible relationship between the two, which is why they have this to the legislative body. The reason they have it to the legislative body, the power of overriding a veto, it makes sense because they make laws. So it's pretty simple, but that'll end this one. I greatly appreciate everyone tuning in, as always. Please check out the weekend special. Check out all the current event episodes. Like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. Drop the mic on people, let them know about the podcast. And I will see you all next time. Thank you and take care.